The night my wife tried to drug me for the first time, she was humming. Not humming the way people hum when they're distracted. Humming the way people hum when they're content. When something is going right. When the world feels like it's moving exactly the way they need it to move. That detail, of all the details I have collected over the past year and a half, is the one that still stops me cold when I think about it too long. Not the vial I found. Not the phone calls I listened to. Not the documents I eventually spread across a detective's desk on a Tuesday afternoon while he looked at me over his reading glasses with an expression that told me he had seen this before, but not quite like this. The humming. Because she was happy. She was genuinely, quietly happy. And she was happy because she was putting something in my tea that was slowly, deliberately, chemically erasing me. And she hummed while she did it. Like it was just another Tuesday. Like it was just the chamomile with honey she'd been making me for 11 years. My name is David. I'm 61 years old. I spent 40 years as an insurance fraud investigator before I retired. I have spent my entire adult life learning to see things that other people miss. Discrepancies, patterns, the small details that don't quite line up with the story being told. I have uncovered corporate fraud worth tens of millions of dollars. I have testified in federal court. I have sat across from people who looked me dead in the eye and told me elaborate, practiced, convincing lies. And for 8 months, the person who fooled me most completely was the woman I had shared a bed with for over a decade. I'm not telling you this story because I want sympathy. I passed the point where I needed sympathy a long time ago. I'm telling you this story because I know that somewhere out there, maybe right now, maybe in a house that looks a lot like mine did, someone is sitting with that feeling. That quiet, persistent, impossible to explain feeling that something is wrong. That things don't add up. That the person they love most is somehow not quite the person they thought they knew. And I want that person to hear me say, your gut is not lying to you. It never does. The question is only whether you're ready to listen to it. I wasn't ready. Not at first. It took me longer than it should have, and I've made my peace with that. But I got there. And what I found when I started looking, what I uncovered over 6 months of staying silent and watching and waiting, was something I never could have anticipated when this all began. So let me take you back to the real beginning. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Carol and I met at a work function in the spring of 2012. She was working in hospital administration at the time. I was there representing the firm I worked for, investigating a benefits fraud case that had tentacles into the health system she managed. We weren't supposed to meet the way we met. We met because the buffet line ran out of the pasta salad she'd been looking forward to, and I had taken the last of it, and she was standing behind me when I turned around with my plate. She said, very calmly, "You have something that belongs to me." I gave her half my pasta salad. We talked for 2 hours. I asked her to dinner 4 days later. That's the woman I married. Quick, dry, funny in a way that snuck up on you. Practical, organized. The kind of person who remembers where you left your keys when you've given up looking. The kind of person who schedules the car service appointment before the car needs it. Who reads the fine print on contracts before she signs them, who buys the birthday card 3 weeks early so she never has to rush. I loved all of those things about her. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came later, whatever I learned, whatever happened in that kitchen in the end, I loved her. And the version of her I fell in love with was real. I have to believe that. Because if it wasn't real, then I wasted 11 years. And I refuse to believe that. What I think happened, what I've come to understand, slowly, over many months of sitting with it, is that people can be two things at once. They can love you and also be capable of something terrible. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's the one I have to live with. The first sign that something had shifted came about 6 months after my father was diagnosed. My father, Robert, was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition in the autumn of 2022. He was 81 years old. He had lived a full life, a long career in commercial real estate, a modest fortune built carefully over 50 years, a house he'd owned outright since 1987, and a set of investment accounts that had grown slowly and steadily the way his father had taught him they should. He wasn't wealthy in the way that makes the news, but he was comfortable, and he was careful, and he had spent a significant portion of his retirement organizing his estate so that the people he loved would be taken care of after he was gone. I was named executor and primary beneficiary. There was a secondary clause in the estate documents, one I had signed at the attorney's office, standing next to Carol while she watched over my shoulder, that stated if I were ever declared legally incompetent, Control of the estate would transfer to my spouse pending probate resolution. I signed that clause and didn't think about it again for almost 2 years. Carol thought about it. I know that now. My father declined over about 14 months. It was slow and it was hard, and Carol was, I thought, wonderful through all of it. She came to appointments. She helped manage his schedule when I was overwhelmed with work. She organized his paperwork when he could no longer do it himself. She sat with me in the parking garage of the hospital on 3 separate occasions while I cried, and she rubbed circles on my back and said, "I've got you, David. Whatever happens, I'm right here." He died on a Thursday morning in March of 2023. I was with him. Carol arrived 20 minutes after he passed. She held my hand in the corridor and said all the right things, and I believed every word of them. I now know that 14 months before he died, while he was still in the early stages of his diagnosis, while we were still hoping for the best, Carol had attended a private dinner and met a man named Dr. Gerald Renner. Dr. Renner was a neurologist. He was well-credentialed, well-regarded at first glance, and had built a very specific kind of practice over the previous 9 years. He specialized in what he called capacity evaluations, assessments of cognitive function in aging or distressed patients that could be used to determine legal competency. And he had been introduced to Carol by her brother, Thomas. Thomas is 4 years younger than Carol. I had known him for as long as I'd known her, and I had never fully trusted him, though I couldn't have told you exactly why until everything came out. He had a quality I associate with a certain kind of dishonesty, a quality of always seeming like he was calculating something just behind whatever expression he had on his face. He borrowed money from us twice. He never paid either loan back, and when I brought it up once, very gently, he acted as though I had insulted him. Carol always made excuses for him. He's had a hard time. He's getting his footing. He means well. David, you just have to know him. I knew him well enough. What I didn't know was that Thomas had a relationship with Dr. Renner that went back several years, a financial relationship, as it turned out, that involved a quiet referral arrangement. Thomas found the right families. Renner provided the evaluations. The evaluations produced the paperwork, and the paperwork moved money. He had done it before. 3 times that investigators eventually confirmed, possibly more. All elderly or recently bereaved spouses with assets worth pursuing. All declared incompetent within months of the initial evaluation. All with families who either didn't look closely enough or didn't look in time. This was not 2 desperate people making a terrible decision under pressure. This was a system. This was something they had built and refined and operated more than once. And when my father died and left a significant estate in my name, with that clause sitting quietly in the documents Carol had watched me sign, Thomas brought my wife's name to Dr. Renner's attention. Or perhaps it happened the other way around. Perhaps Carol brought Thomas into it. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that by the time my father was buried, they already had a plan. The tea started about 6 weeks after the funeral. Not immediately. She was smarter than that. She let a month pass. Let me grieve. Let things settle into the new quiet of a house where the phone no longer rang from the care facility, where the calendar no longer had appointment blocks in it, where I was finally, slowly, beginning to breathe again. Then one evening, she came into the living room where I was reading and set a mug down on the table beside me. "Chamomile," she said. "You've been so tense lately. This'll help you sleep." I thanked her. I drank it. I slept deeply that night. Very deeply. In that particular way where you don't move and you don't dream and you surface the next morning feeling like you've been somewhere far away. I assumed it was the grief. I assumed my body was finally catching up to everything it had been carrying. The tea became a nightly routine. Carol framed it as care, as something she was doing for me because she was worried about my stress levels, because she knew how hard the last year had been, because she wanted me to rest. And it worked. Every night, I slept in that deep, dreamless, unreachable way. Every morning, I woke with a heaviness behind my eyes that I couldn't shake before noon. Within 2 months, I was losing things. A watch my father gave me for my retirement, gone. I searched the house twice. A set of cufflinks I'd owned since my wedding day. A small painting that had hung in our hallway for 6 years. Cash I kept in my desk drawer for incidentals, which I was almost certain had been $300 and was suddenly $40. When I mentioned these things to Carol, she would do something very precise. She wouldn't dismiss me outright. She would tilt her head, just slightly, and look at me with a measured, careful concern that managed to express both love and worry simultaneously. And she would say, "David, you've been so forgetful lately. Are you sure you didn't just misplace it? Maybe we should think about seeing someone. She said it gently enough that believed her. That's what I need you to understand. I believed her. I started keeping a log on my phone of things I'd lost, tasks I'd completed, conversations I'd had, so that I could check my own memory. I genuinely thought something was wrong with me. I thought the stress, the grief, the age, I thought it was all finally catching up. I started to be afraid of my own mind. And that, of course, was exactly the point. It was a Thursday in February when everything changed. Carol had left her bag on the kitchen counter before going upstairs to shower. I wasn't looking through it. I want to be clear about that, because the details matter to me. I reached past it to get something from the cabinet, and the strap caught on my arm, and the bag tipped and spilled across the counter. I started picking things up. Her wallet, her phone, a packet of tissues, a tube of hand lotion, a set of keys that I didn't recognize, house-shaped, no label, which I noted and set aside in my mind. And then, at the very bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in a fold of fabric as though it was something precious, a small glass vial. Dark liquid, thick, almost viscous. No label. I picked it up and held it under the kitchen light. I stood there for a long time. I'm a fraud investigator. I have spent 4 decades training myself to feel the difference between coincidence and pattern. And standing in my own kitchen holding that vial, 40 years of professional instinct told me one thing with total, devastating clarity. This is what's in the tea. I put the vial back exactly as it had been. I rearranged the bag. I wiped down the counter. I went to the living room and sat in my chair and picked up the book I'd been reading, and I sat there with my eyes on the page and my mind completely elsewhere, going over everything. Every foggy morning, every lost object, every moment of practiced concern on Carol's face, and letting it rearrange itself into a different picture than the one I'd been looking at. When she came downstairs 20 minutes later with the tea, I thanked her. I said it smelled wonderful. I waited until she turned to get a blanket from the closet, and in that 4-second window, I switched our cups. She drank her own tea that night. She slept like she was made of stone. I lay awake beside her in the dark for 3 hours, watching the ceiling, thinking. I didn't go to the police that week. I want to explain why, because I know it's the question people ask most often when I tell this story. The answer is simple. I had nothing. Not yet. I had a vial with an unknown substance, and a wife who would say she bought it at a wellness shop and had no idea it had fallen into her bag. I had a pattern of foggy mornings that could be attributed to grief and age. I had missing objects that I myself had been recording as memory lapses. I had, in other words, exactly the situation she had constructed, a picture in which I was the unreliable one, and she was the concerned spouse. If I had walked into a police station that night with what I had, they would have been sympathetic and done nothing. So I did what I knew how to do. I began an investigation. The morning after I found the vial, I drove 2 towns over to a private testing laboratory I'd used during my career. I used a cotton swab to collect a small sample from the vial before Carol woke up. I dropped it at the lab on my way to get coffee, and I told them I needed a full chemical analysis and I needed it within 48 hours. They charged me $400. I paid it without asking questions. Those 2 days were the longest of my life. I went through them the way I went through every difficult stretch of my career, methodically, 1 hour at a time, focusing on what I could control. I continued the nightly cup swap. I continued performing confusion at breakfast. I continued letting Carol look at me with that measured, practiced concern and telling me what a good husband I was to let her take care of me. I smiled. I thanked her. I went to bed early and lay there in the dark with my eyes open. The lab called on the second afternoon. The technician's voice was careful and neutral, the voice of someone who is very deliberately not editorializing. He told me what they'd found. The substance in the vial was a concentrated sedative compound, the kind used in high-level psychiatric care. In carefully measured small doses, it produces deep sleep and short-term memory disruption. In sustained use over an extended period, the clinical term used in the report was progressive cognitive impairment. In plain language, in large enough quantities, over long enough time, it causes permanent damage. She wasn't just putting me to sleep. She was, incrementally, erasing me. Not quickly. That would have raised questions. Slowly. Patiently. The way a careful person does something they want to look natural. I sat in the parking lot of the laboratory for a long time before I drove home. Not because I was devastated. Not anymore. I sat there because I was doing math. And the math was telling me that a woman doesn't acquire a concentrated psychiatric sedative and administer it to her husband every night for a minor gain. The investment, the risk, the planning, the patience it required meant the payoff had to be significant. My father's estate. The incompetency clause. I went home. I made dinner. I sat across from Carol at the kitchen table and asked her about her day, and she told me about a problem with a vendor at work, and I listened and nodded and asked follow-up questions. And I thought, 40 years of looking people in the eye who are lying to me. I know how to do this. I know how to wait. The next morning I called Frank. Franklin Osei had been my closest colleague for 22 years before he retired and opened a private practice specializing in high-asset domestic investigations. He is the most methodical human being I have ever met, which is saying something. He doesn't use the word probably. He uses confirmed or unconfirmed. He doesn't speculate. He documents. I told him I needed to meet. I told him it was personal. He drove to my office that afternoon, and I locked the door and I laid out everything. The vial, the lab report, the pattern of sleepiness and lost objects, the incompetency clause in my father's estate documents, the specialist Carol had been mentioning with increasing frequency. I talked for 40 minutes without stopping. Frank sat across from me and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "David, she's not working alone." I asked him what made him say that. He pointed at the name Carol had given me for the specialist, Dr. Gerald Renner. "I know that name," Frank said. "He had his license reviewed twice in the last decade. Ethics complaints, both times. Nothing that stuck, but the pattern was always the same. Elderly or vulnerable patients, competency evaluations that moved unusually fast, assets that transferred shortly after." He looked at me. "You don't find a doctor like Renner on a Google search. Someone referred her to him. Someone who knows what he does." I thought about that for a moment. And then I knew. "Thomas," I said. Frank nodded slowly. "Let me do some digging." Over the next 2 weeks, Frank built a picture that was more extensive than either of us had anticipated. He found the financial connection between Thomas and Renner, a consulting arrangement through a shell company that had been active for 7 years. He found 3 prior cases linked to Renner's practice in which patients had been declared incompetent within 6 months of evaluation, all with significant assets, all resulting in estate transfers that resolved with unusual speed. He found that one of those prior patients, a woman named Eleanor, 74 years old at the time, had spent 11 months in a private care facility before her daughter finally hired an attorney and began asking the right questions. Eleanor had recovered most of her cognitive function once she was removed from the facility's care regimen. The substance she'd been given was chemically similar to what was in the vial I'd found in Carol's bag. And then Frank found something else. Something that changed the temperature of the whole situation. He found a second set of accounts, opened in Carol's name, not our joint accounts, not anything I had access to, through a financial institution in a different state. The accounts had been opened 11 months before my father died. 11 months before he was even severely ill. She had been preparing a place to put money before there was money to move. And she had been quietly moving things into those accounts for months. Small amounts. Patient amounts. The amounts of someone who knows what they're doing and intends not to be caught. I went home that evening and made dinner and asked Carol how her day had been. She told me she'd had a difficult meeting. I said I was sorry to hear it. She brought me my tea, and I thanked her, and when she turned away I switched the cups. 163 days of switching the cups by that point. I had stopped counting after the first 100 and then started again. I don't know why. Perhaps because counting felt like control. Perhaps because every number was evidence of something she didn't know I knew, and knowing that felt like the only solid ground I had. Let me tell you what it costs to do what I did for 6 months. People hear the story and they focus on the strategy of it, the cup swaps, the investigation, the evidence gathering. And yes, that part required patience and discipline. But the part that nobody asks about is the part that was actually the hardest. It's the performance. Every morning I woke up sharp and clear, because I hadn't been drugged, because I was sleeping naturally, because I was fine, and I had to climb back into the character of a man who wasn't fine. I had to stagger slightly coming downstairs. I had to pause in doorways as though I'd lost my train of thought. I had to ask Carol what day it was, sometimes twice, and watch her face do that specific thing it did when she thought the plan was working. That quiet settling, that almost imperceptible exhale of a woman who believes she is watching something she built come to life exactly as intended. I had to sit across from her at breakfast and make small talk about the weather and the neighbors and what we needed from the grocery store. I had to let her touch my hand and say, "You look tired, honey." and respond with something soft and grateful. I had to maintain that performance every single day, with no break, no moment where I could drop it and just be myself. And at the same time, I was conducting a full investigation. I was meeting with Frank every few days. I was reviewing documents. I was building a file. I was doing all of that while also, and this is the part that I think would break most people, grieving my father. Because I hadn't had the chance to do that properly. I'd been too busy surviving what came after his death to actually mourn him. Some nights I would wait until Carol was asleep, and I would go sit in my study and just breathe. Just exist without the performance for an hour. Sometimes I'd look at a photograph of my father on the bookshelf and have a one-sided conversation with him in my head. I'd tell him what was happening. I'd ask him what he thought I should do next. He always would have said, "Follow the evidence, David. Don't get ahead of it." So that's what I did. About 3 months in, Carol told me she'd made me a doctor's appointment. She said it over dinner, in that gentle, practiced way she had, not as a suggestion, as something already decided. "I've been so worried about you, David. I spoke with a colleague of mine, and she recommended a neurologist. Just a baseline assessment, nothing scary. Just so we have a picture of where you are." I said that sounded reasonable. I said I appreciated her looking out for me. I watched her face do the settling thing. I called Frank the next morning. He already knew about Renner's involvement, had confirmed it 2 weeks earlier through the referral trail he'd traced from Thomas. Now we had a timeline. The appointment was set for a Tuesday, 6 weeks out. That was the deadline. That was when Carol and Thomas needed me to appear sufficiently impaired to justify Renner signing the competency evaluation in their favor. 6 weeks was enough time, but only just. Frank made contact with a detective named Sandra Okafor, who worked financial crimes at the county level. She had been building a case against Renner for 2 years, had 2 prior victims willing to testify, but had been waiting for a live case she could catch in real time. Frank brought her my file. She drove to his office, read through everything, and called me that evening. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "we want to help you, but we need you to hold your position for a few more weeks. Can you do that?" I told her I'd been doing it for 3 months. A few more weeks was nothing. She said she'd be in touch. It was during those final weeks that I discovered the thing I hadn't been looking for. The thing that, when I found it, redefined everything I thought I understood about the scope of what Carol and Thomas had planned. Frank had been monitoring Thomas's communication through a legal intercept authorized by Detective Okafor's office. Most of what came through was logistical, scheduling, numbers, references to accounts and timelines that Frank cataloged carefully. But one evening, a message came through that was different from the others. "Thomas, to an unknown number. Renner knows someone who handles the next stage. Clean. After the papers are signed. It would look like natural decline. He says it doesn't take long if the dosage is adjusted properly." Frank called me within 5 minutes of the message coming through. He read it to me over the phone in his flat, careful voice. When he finished, he waited. I said, "They aren't planning to put me in a facility." Frank said, "No, they were going to declare me incompetent. Get the estate transferred, and then make sure I wasn't around long enough to challenge it." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Carol humming in the kitchen. I thought about the way she rubbed circles on my back in the hospital parking garage while I cried. I thought about 11 years of a life I thought I understood. And then I called Detective Okafor and told her I was ready to move whenever she was. She said, 2 days, Mr. Harrington. Give me 2 days to get everything in position." On the night the operation ran, Carol made the tea as usual. I came into the kitchen and she was standing at the counter, her back to me, stirring. Not humming tonight, quieter than usual actually. She had the appointment with Renner in 3 days. I wonder, looking back, whether some part of her sensed that something was different, whether some animal instinct told her that the ground had shifted, or whether she was simply focused, running through the final steps of a plan she'd spent over a year building. She turned and handed me the cup, gave me the smile, said, "You look tired, honey. Drink this and let's have an early night." I took the cup. I looked at her. I held her gaze for a moment longer than usual, long enough for her to notice, I think, though she kept her expression perfectly steady. And then I said, "Carol, I need to tell you something." She tilted her head. The concerned expression arrived, precisely on schedule. "Of course. What is it?" "I know," I said. A pause. Controlled. "Know what, David?" "Everything," I said. "The vial. The accounts. Thomas. Dr. Renner. The message about the next stage after the papers are signed." Something happened in her face then. Not a collapse. She was too composed for that. It was more like a structure losing integrity from the inside. The scaffolding of the expression held for a moment, and then, very slowly, something beneath it gave way. "David, don't," I said, quietly. "Please. 11 years. Let's not do that part." I set the cup down on the counter. Her cup, not mine. I hadn't touched mine, and I slid the manila envelope across the surface toward her. The envelope Frank and I had prepared. The lab report, the financial records, the Intercept transcripts, the documentation of Renner's prior cases, the statement from Eleanor's daughter. "The people outside have copies of everything in there," I said. She looked at the envelope. She looked at me. And for the first and only moment in this entire ordeal, Carol looked like she didn't have a script. The front door opened. Detective Okafor walked in with 2 officers. She introduced herself to Carol in the calm, measured tone of someone who has done this many times, and she was very professional and very clear about what was happening and why. Thomas was arrested at his apartment 20 minutes later. Renner was taken into custody at his home simultaneously. The shell accounts were frozen by morning. I went to my brother's house that night. He made me a cup of coffee, real coffee, not tea, and we sat at his kitchen table until 2 in the morning, and I told him everything. He didn't say much. He mostly just listened. At one point, he put his hand on top of mine and kept it there for a while without saying anything, and that was exactly right. I slept on his couch that night. No dreams, no heaviness, no hours I couldn't account for. Just sleep, ordinary and clean, the way it's supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved the way legal processes do, slowly, and then all at once. Carol cooperated with the county attorney's office in exchange for reduced charges. Her cooperation was significant enough to accelerate both Thomas's prosecution and the case against Renner. Thomas is awaiting trial. Renner's license has been permanently revoked. 2 of his prior cases that had been closed were reopened for criminal investigation. Eleanor, the woman whose case Frank had found, the 74-year-old who spent 11 months in a facility, is doing well. Her daughter called me once, just to thank me, though I told her I hadn't done it for her specifically. I'd done it because there was no other option. The estate is intact. My father's accounts, his property, everything he spent 50 years building, all of it is where he intended it to be. I did go to see Carol once, through her attorney, before the plea was finalized. Not to confront her, not to ask her to explain herself. I'm not sure there's an explanation that would have made sense to me, and I've stopped needing one. I went because I had spent 11 years with this person, and I wanted to say goodbye in a way that was honest. I told her I didn't hate her. I told her that whatever had turned in her, whatever moment or pressure or calculation had taken her from the woman I married to the person who stood at a kitchen counter humming while she prepared something designed to erase me. I had to believe it wasn't who she had always been. I had to believe there was a version of her that had meant it when she made the promises she made. She didn't say much. She looked older than I expected. She said, "I'm sorry, David." I said, "I know," and I left. 3 weeks after the arrests, I went to my father's house for the first time since he'd died. I'd been avoiding it. Not consciously, or maybe consciously, but not honestly. I told myself I was giving the estate process time to settle. But the truth is I wasn't ready to be in his space without the distraction of a crisis. For a year and a half, there had always been something urgent. His illness, his death, the investigation, the case. The moment I walked into that house without any of that, I was going to have to just be a son who had lost his father. And I wasn't ready for how simple and enormous that was going to feel. His study was exactly as he'd left it. His pipe in the ashtray. His reading glasses folded on top of a book he'd been in the middle of, a biography of Eisenhower, which would have been exactly the kind of thing he'd read. A coffee ring on the corner of his desk from a cup set down and never returned to. I sat in his chair for a long time without doing anything. Then I opened the second drawer of his desk, the one he used for personal documents, and I found the envelope. My name on the front, in his handwriting, tucked underneath the estate summary he'd left for the attorney, as though he'd put it there at the last moment, separately, just for me. I opened it slowly. It was 3 pages, handwritten, the handwriting getting slightly less steady toward the end in the way his handwriting had been in his final months. He'd written it sometime in his last weeks, I think. He'd known he was running out of time. I'm not going to read you all of it. Some of it belongs only to me. But there's a part I want to share. Because it's the part that finally broke me open in the way I'd been holding back through all of it. Through the investigation, through the confrontation, through the legal proceedings, through all the careful, composed, professional management of something that was also, Underneath all of that, just heartbreak. He wrote, David, you have always been the kind of man who fixes things. Since you were a boy, when something was wrong, you needed to make it right. That is one of the things I have always admired most about you. But here is what I need you to hear, now that I won't be there to say it in person. The most important thing I'm leaving you is not in any of the accounts. It's not the house. It's not the portfolio. Those are just numbers. What I'm leaving you is this. I loved you. Completely, the whole time, without reservation. And the measure of a life is not what you accumulate. It's whether the people you love knew that you loved them. I knew. You made sure I knew. That's enough. That's more than enough. Now let yourself be happy. You've earned it. I sat in his chair, and I cried for a long time. Not with restraint and not quietly. The way you cry when you've been holding something for too long and your body finally decides it's done waiting for a convenient moment. And when I was done, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. Here's what I know now that I didn't know when this started. Betrayal doesn't always look like betrayal. That's the thing nobody tells you. We have this image of it, a dramatic moment, an obvious lie, something that announces itself. But real betrayal, the kind that actually works, looks like care. It looks like concern. It looks like someone bringing you a warm cup of tea and sitting beside you and saying all the right things. It is patient and it is practiced and it is learned to wear the face of love because that is the only face that lets it get close enough to do what it intends to do. And the reason it works is not because we are foolish. It's because we are human. Because we are built to trust the people we love. Because extending that trust is not a flaw. It is, in fact, one of the best things about us. The failure was not mine. The failure belonged entirely to the person who decided to exploit it. I want to be very clear about that. Because I spent some time in the middle of all of this blaming myself. Asking how I hadn't seen it sooner. Wondering what kind of investigator misses something happening in his own kitchen. And the answer is, the kind who was also a husband. The kind who was also grieving. The kind who was also a human being with a heart that wanted the person beside him to be who he thought she was. Being deceived is not the same as being foolish. Trusting someone who chose to betray that trust is not a failure of judgment. It is a failure of their character, not yours. The sooner you can hold that distinction clearly, the sooner you can put down the weight that isn't yours to carry. If you're somewhere right now with that feeling, the one that's quiet and persistent and won't quite go away no matter how many reasonable explanations you find for it, I want you to take it seriously. Not with panic, not with accusation, but seriously. Trust is not the same as blindness. Love is not the same as willful ignorance. You can love someone and still pay attention. You can care about a relationship and still trust what your gut is telling you. Start writing things down. Start noticing the patterns. Talk to someone outside the situation who you trust completely, not to convince them of anything, just to hear yourself say it out loud to another person. And if what you find when you start looking confirms what your instincts have been telling you, then know that there are people who can help. Professionals who have seen this before. Detectives and attorneys and investigators and advocates who do this work every day and know how to do it right. You don't have to figure it out alone. I almost tried to, and it would have been a mistake. The people who helped me, Frank, Detective Okafor, the lab technician who handed me a piece of paper and changed the course of everything. They mattered. The right people, at the right time, make an enormous difference. Don't be too proud to let them help. I'm sitting in my father's study right now as I tell you this. I come here most mornings. I make my coffee in his old percolator, the one that takes twice as long as a modern machine and makes coffee twice as good. And I sit in his chair and I read for an hour before I start my day. It has become the thing I look forward to most. This quiet hour. This particular light through this particular window. The sound of the birds that have apparently always lived in the oak tree on the east side of the house, which I somehow never noticed until now. I am not entirely healed. I don't think that's how it works. There are still mornings when I reach for a cup and feel the ghost of that old wariness. The reflex of a man who spent 6 months never quite being sure what was in what he was drinking. It passes quickly, but it passes, not disappears. I've accepted that it will probably always be there in some small form. The way scar tissue is always there even when the wound is fully closed. What I can tell you is this. I am better than I was. I am clearer. I am more present than I was even before all of this started. Before the tea, before the vial, before the year and a half of loss and grief and investigation and revelation. Somewhere in the process of being forced to pay very close attention to everything around me, I rediscovered the habit of actually seeing what's in front of me. The oak tree. The percolator. The coffee ring my father left on the corner of his desk that I will never, under any circumstances, clean. My father left me something real. Not the estate. The estate is just money and property. It's useful, and I'm grateful, but it is not the thing. He left me the letter. He left me his chair and his study and his percolator and 40 years of example of what it looks like to build something carefully and honestly and with your whole heart. That's the inheritance that matters. That's the thing they were never going to be able to take, no matter what they tried. You cannot drug someone out of knowing who they are. You can slow them down. You can confuse them. You can make them doubt themselves for a while. But eventually, if there's enough there, enough foundation, enough love laid down over enough years, they find their footing again. They come back to themselves. I came back to myself. And here I am. Thank you for sitting with me through all of this. I know it's a long story. I know there are parts of it that are hard to hear. But I believe that stories like this one matter. Not because they are dramatic, though they are, but because they are true. Because they describe something that happens in ordinary houses to ordinary people who are doing their best to love someone and be loved in return. And because the more those stories are told out loud, the less power the silence around them has. If something in this story reached you, if any part of it reminded you of something you've lived, or are living, or are afraid might be happening, please don't carry that alone. Tell someone. Write it down. Take it seriously. You deserve to be safe in your own home. You deserve to drink your tea without wondering what's in it. You deserve a life that is entirely, completely yours. I'm David. This was my story. I hope it was worth your time. Take care of yourselves. And take care of each other. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. I read every single comment, and I'm always listening. See you soon.